Hi, this is Gerald Watt, Executive Director of Sauk Valley Voices of Recovery. A few months back, we started our Tuesday Talks series with a TED Talk by Johann Hari, in which he discussed the opposite of addiction being connection. We were lucky enough to have Johann Hari participate in our RecoverCon event here at Sauk Valley Community College. Of course, he had to do it virtually due to COVID and him living in London, but we did get a speech by him that really went further in and talked about how we in the Sauk Valley can take what he is suggesting and get it to the next level. So for today's Tuesday Talk, we'd like to present that presentation done in September of this year at Sauk Valley College by Johann Hari. Please enjoy.
I happened to be turned on to Johann Hari's TED Talk, addiction, the opposite of addiction is connection. And it changed my life. It literally, I sat there and I said, somebody finally said what I've been feeling and had been able to wrap the words around. And I started showing around to people. And, I am kind of working with a KIL to kind of quarterback this huge grant for this area. And I went to a KIL and I said, this is what has to be the core of our work towards recovery, And this is where we're trying to build our recovery center and our affinity groups and all that. And the KIL said, well, that's great, but, what does it mean? And I was trying to explain it. And I said, I'm not getting the gist of it. I said, I'm going to see if I can get Johann to explain it to you guys. So I sent an email to Johann, and I didn't hear from him for a while. And I'm like, this guy's too busy. He's not going to reply. And then all of a sudden, I got this email back, and he's like, oh, yeah, I'd love to. so Johann, thank you very much for paying attention to our tiny little borough. And I'm going to turn it over to you. We appreciate you, and I'll talk to you later when you're done.
Oh, thank you. I'm so moved by that. And I'm really, really sad that I'm not there with you. It's another reason why I hate COVID. And if any of you have a way to eradicate it, please introduce it immediately. I always get slightly paranoid when I do any speeches where people can see my place, because I don't know if you remember at the start of COVID, there was an Australian politician who did a Zoom, and he had a bookcase behind him. And it turned out that the only books he had behind him were the 86 volumes collected speeches of Adolf Hitler. And everyone was like, why do you have everything Hitler ever said? And he didn't have a good explanation, so he had to resign. Obviously, I don't own all of Hitler's speeches, but I get suddenly paranoid about, oh my God, what can people see behind me? But so I'm really excited to talk to you about addiction today. This is particularly important right now, as you guys know much better than I do, because during the pandemic, this bizarre situation we've all been living through for whatever it is, 20 months now, there has been a big increase in addiction and overdose deaths and alcohol-related deaths. And we were already at historic highs for addiction deaths. So I want to talk to you about why. Why is it that during a pandemic where we had to separate, I think for necessary reasons, addiction and the deaths related to it would go up? And I learned about this for a very personal reason. There's a lot of addiction in my family. There still is. It's very painful. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I didn't understand why then. But as I got older, I realized we had addiction in my family. And when I started researching this subject for my book, Chasing the Scream, eight years ago now, I can't believe it was 8 years ago. No, more, 9 years ago now. Like a lot of people who have someone they love with addiction problems, I was a real mixture of feelings. So I felt a lot of love for the people I knew who had addiction problems, and I could see they were really suffering. If I'm honest, there's another part of me that was very angry, and that kind of had these, although I never supported the drug war, I had these kind of drug war-like voices in my head that were like, why doesn't somebody just stop you? I felt this mixture of emotions. I wasn't doing any good for the people I loved with addiction problems. So I ended up going on this big journey all over the world to try to figure out what's really going on here and what I could do about it. So I didn't realize how big the journey would be at the start, but I ended up traveling over 30,000 miles. I wanted to go to the places that had adopted just really different approaches with addiction, and just people who'd had very different experiences around drugs, the drug war. So I met a crazy mixture of people, from a trans crack dealer in Brooklyn called Chino Hardin, who's one of the wisest people I know, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel. He is definitely not one of the wisest people I know, to the only country that's decriminalized all drugs with incredible results. I'm going to come to that. And I learned a huge amount. I learned that drugs are not what we think they are. Addiction is not what we think it is. The war on drugs is not what we think it is. And the alternatives to the war on drugs are not what we think they are. But I wanted to start where I start the book, actually, with a story that I think when some people read it, for a minute, they think, why are you starting a story about addiction with this story? But I think it tells you so much about how we got where we are and where we need to go. In 1939, in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, Billie Holiday walked onto a stage in a hotel where they didn't even let her walk through the front door because she was Black. They made her go through the service entrance. And she stood on a stage in front of a mixed audience of Black and white people, and she sang a song called Strange Fruit. And a lot of you will know that song. It's a song about the idea that in the South, there's a strange fruit that hangs from the trees. And as the song goes on, you slowly realize it's the bodies of Black men who've been murdered by racists. And as one of her godchildren said to me, you've got to understand how explosive this was. At that time, there were no political pop songs. All pop music was like kind of songs like P.S. I Love You, really kind of sweet, saccharine songs. And Billie Holiday stands in front of this audience and sings this song that was later called the musical firing gun for the civil rights movement, right? Key moment. And not long afterwards, Billie Holiday got a warning from the agents of a man called Harry Anslinger. And the warning basically said, stop singing this song. And this is where I open the book. And it might seem odd, but this tells you something, right? So I want to explain who this man was and why he's so important to the story we have about addiction and what we do to people with addiction problems right now. So Harry Anslinger was a government bureaucrat who took over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition was ending. So he had this huge government department that was about to have nothing to do. And he wanted to keep it going. And to keep it going, he invented the modern war on drugs. He's the first person to ever use the war on drugs, way before Reagan or Nixon or anyone like that. And he built the war on drugs around two groups he really intensely hated. The first was Black people, Latinos, and Chinese Americans. He was so racist that he was regarded as an extreme racist in the 1920s, which was quite hard to do, right? He used the N-word so often in official police memos. His own senator said he should have to resign. The second group he hated was addicts. When he was a kid, he grew up in a place called Altoona in Pennsylvania, and he grew up on a farm next to the next farm down. There was the farmer's wife had an addiction problem, and it terrified him. And he believed that you needed to violently suppress addiction, or it would spread like typhoid. That was how he put it. And to Harry Anslinger, Billie Holiday is the symbol of everything he hated. She's a Black woman resisting white supremacy and persuading a lot of white people. And Billie Holiday had an addiction problem. Billie grew up in a part of Baltimore that was known as Pigtown. It was the last part of the United States that didn't even have a sewer system. Unbelievably poor. And she knew her grandmother, who had been born into slavery. And she grows up here. And when she's 10 years old, one day a 42-year-old man named Wilbur Rich comes and says, oh, your mother has sent me to get you. I've got to take you to your mother. So 10-year-old Billie went with this man, and Wilbur Rich raped her. He was caught. Wilbur Rich was punished. He was sent to prison for 18 months. Billie Holiday was punished much more severely. She was sent to a convent run by nuns for bad girls. That was how they put it. They said that she was a whore. That's the word they used. They said that she had made this man do it. She had provoked him. Billie Holiday, even at the age of 10, did not accept this bullshit. She said, it's not true. It's not right. And so they decided to break her. They punished her in increasingly escalating ways. One thing they did is they had a part of the church where bodies were brought to be buried, and they locked her in overnight with the dead bodies. You can't imagine the cruelty of this system. And Billie Holiday ran away to find her mother, who was working at that time in a brothel in Harlem. So Billie runs away, she gets to her mother, and she starts working, and I'm putting working in inverted commas, of course, alongside her mother. She's being prostituted as a child. So she's raped by strangers for money, day after day, week after week. We'll never know how many men raped her, but an extraordinary number. And in those circumstances, entirely predictably, Billie Holiday is in dreadful pain and she needs to anesthetize herself. And she starts drinking a hell of a lot of alcohol and later starts using heroin and other drugs because of the agony that she was in. In addition to being in terrible pain, as you all know, Billie Holiday is one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century, comparable to Picasso, right? She invents a whole new way of singing, one that transforms American singing, people like Frank Sinatra. So they learned the way they sang from Billie Holiday. Harry Anslinger resolves to destroy Billie Holiday, right? She's everything he hates, as I say. So he decides to send an officer to follow her around to document her drug use so they can bust her. And Harry Anslinger hated employing black people, but you couldn't really employ a white guy to go and follow Billie Holiday everywhere. Around Harlem, it'd be kind of obvious. So Harry Anslinger employed a man named Jimmy Fletcher, who was called a bag man. And he was told, follow her everywhere, document her drug use, document the drug use of any other black musicians that you meet. We're going to bust them all. And Jimmy Fletcher started following her everywhere. For 18 months, he danced with her, he got to know her, got to know her little dogs. And Billie Holiday was so amazing that it seems to me when you read the interview transcripts with him that Jimmy Fletcher fell in love with her. And his whole life, he felt really ashamed of what he did next. They arrested her, they busted her. She was put on trial. The trial was called The United States versus Billie Holiday, which is the name of the book that was adapted. Sorry, the name of the movie that was adapted from my book. And they sent her to prison. She's given an 18-month prison sentence. She doesn't sing a word in prison. But when she gets out, they do something even crueler to her. At that time, to perform in most places where you could, where alcohol was served, you needed something called a cabaret performer's license. Billie Holiday was denied a cabaret performer's license. Anslinger makes sure she's denied it. So as one of her friends said to me, Yolanda Bavan, what's the cruelest thing you can do to someone? Is to take away the thing they love. They take away a lot of singing from Billie Holiday. This, by the way, is what we do to people with addiction problems all over the United States today. We give them criminal records. Instead of helping them reconnect with the society, we put barriers between them and reconnecting with the society. In this situation, entirely predictably, Billie Holiday was in agony again and she relapsed. And one day she collapsed in Midtown Manhattan, not far from where she'd first sung Strange Fruit. And she was in a terrible state. And the first hospital she was taken to refused to even take her because she had an addiction problem. Second hospital agreed to take her. And Billie said to her friend, Maylie Dufty, that Anslinger wasn't finished with her. She said, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them, they're going to kill me. She wasn't wrong. In the hospital, Billie was diagnosed with advanced liver cancer, which is probably connected to her very heavy use of alcohol. And she was in a really bad state. And they didn't give her any heroin in the hospital. And going into withdrawal when you're very weak with cancer can be very dangerous. So she went into withdrawal. And she was really ill. And in that state, Anslinger's men come, they arrest her, they handcuffed her to her hospital bed. They wouldn't let her friends in to see her. They took away her record player and her candies. And And I actually interviewed the last surviving person who had been in that room, a man named Reverend Eugene Callender, he'd set up the first ever rehab center in Harlem, and he managed to get in. He was a religious minister. They couldn't turn him away. And he was so horrified. He said that they were killing her, and he went out and he led protests outside the hospital where they had signs saying, "Let Lady Day live." In the hospital, Maylee, her friend, managed to insist that they give her methadone, and she began to physically recover. And then 10 days later, they cut off the methadone, and the next day she died. One of her friends told the BBC that she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. When they had buried her in Harlem, they had police everywhere because they thought that people would burn the place down because they were so angry about what had been done to Billie Holiday. And for me, this story tells us so much, right? It tells us about what the drug war was about right from the start, right? When we think about the war on drugs, many of us, if we're naive, we think, oh, why were drugs banned? Well, it must have been to protect children or to stop people becoming addicted. What's fascinating is, go back to the birth of the drug war, that stuff isn't even discussed. It's launched as an explicitly racist war to suppress Black people and Latinos and Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants. And to this day, as many people in the audience know much better than I do, Black people are no more likely to use or sell drugs than white people, but they make up by far the biggest majority of people who are punished and imprisoned for it, by far. It starts as a racist war, it continues as a racist war. Also, crucially, we see what it does to people with addiction problems. Sometimes we say about addiction, oh, the war on drugs doesn't work when it comes to addiction. Well, that's true, but that's really understating the situation. It's not that it doesn't work, it's that it makes the problem much worse. And Billie Holiday was very aware of that. At every stage, she said, I just want someone to help me. Well, she said this at her trial. All I want is for someone to help me. And when she could have been given help, she was beaten down further. And one of the things I think about a lot, and I thought about a lot as I interviewed Billie Holiday's friends, I remember Annie Ross, who was a great jazz singer who subsequently also died, said to me, who knew Billie well, said to me, people think of Billie Holiday, she was weak. Billie Holiday wasn't weak. Billie Holiday was as strong as she could be. But to me, Billie Holiday's story really helped me to think about the people I love with addiction problems. Because, in our culture, there is one heroic story we tell about addiction, which is that sometimes people with addiction problems go into recovery. And that is indeed an incredibly heroic story. And there's lots of people in the audience who have had that experience, and you should be incredibly proud of yourself. But what Billie Holiday's story taught me is that is not the only heroic story about addiction. Billie Holiday never recovered from her addiction. She died with her addiction problem. She died craving heroin. She was still a hero. She was still an unbelievable hero. When I think about Billie Holiday, the level of her courage, I picture, the person in Tiananmen Square, the massacre in China in 1991, who stands in front of the tank, even though they know the tank is going to roll them over, because it is the right thing to do. That's the level of courage that Billie Holiday showed. And, no matter what they did to her, no matter what Harry Anslinger did to her, Billie Holiday never stopped singing Strange Fruit. She would always find somewhere to go where she could sing it. She would go to the worst parts of the Deep South where they threw bottles at her and screamed the N-word at her, and she sang her song. And to me, when I think about that in relation to people I love who are not in recovery, it really helped me. But also I think about the bigger lesson we can learn from this, right? For nearly 100 years, we have been following this drug war script that was written by Anslinger and by other people. But, all over the world, every day, people listen to Billie Holiday, and it makes them stronger, and it makes them better. And all over the world every day, we continue to follow Harry Anslinger's script, and it makes, with a few exceptions in the world, and I'll come to them, and it makes us weaker and it makes us sicker. And it doesn't have to happen. It never had to be this way. Right from the start, there were hundreds of American doctors who resisted Harry Anslinger, who said this was a disaster. Right from the start, there were people like Billie Holiday who saw that this was insane. This has always been resisted. It is being resisted now. And I think at some point we have to decide to listen to Billie Holiday and not Harry Anslinger. And in some ways, that I think that's related to one of the other big things that I learned about addiction in the research from my book, Chasing the Scream, which was, you know, I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but I realized that I had actually profoundly misunderstood what I had seen in front of me all my life. So if you'd asked me 9 years ago when I started doing the research for the book, if you'd said, well, let's say heroin addiction, because that was close to me. If you'd said to me, what causes heroin addiction? I would have looked at you like you were an idiot. And I would have said, well, the clue's in the name, dummy. Obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told this story for 100 years that's become totally part of our common sense. It's certainly part of mine. So I'm talking to you from London. God, I wish I was in Illinois. But we think if I kidnapped the next 20 people to walk past my building in London, or you kidnapped the next 20 people to walk past the street where the conference is, you know, and you and like a villain in a horror movie, you or I injected everyone we kidnapped every day with heroin 5 times a day, right? We think that at the end of a month of that or whatever, they would all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically crave. And at the end of that month, they'd have this tremendous physical hunger for the drug. And that's what addiction is, right? That's what I believed. It's why, you know, we think addiction is the hunger for the chemical hook. That's why in English, we call it being hooked. And there's some truth in that, but it turns out to be a relatively small part of a much bigger picture. And the first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something not right about this story is when it was explained to me in Britain, where I'm from, as you can tell from my weird Downton Abbey accent. If I stepped out into the street now and I got hit by a truck and I broke my hip, I'd be taken to hospital and I'd be given a lot of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. In fact, it's much better heroin than I could ever score on the streets because it's medically pure, right? It's the good stuff, right? People in British hospitals are given diamorphine a lot, right? If any of you have a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother has taken a lot of heroin. If what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused primarily or entirely by exposure to the chemical hooks, what should be happening to all these people in British hospitals who are being given quite a lot of heroin? Some of them should be becoming addicted and trying to score on the streets when they leave. This has been studied very carefully. It never happens. And when I learned that, I interviewed the scientists about it. I remember saying to them, well, that can't be right. How could you have a situation where you have someone in a hospital bed who's been given lots of really potent heroin, they don't become addicted, and you've got someone in the alleyway shooting up in the alleyway outside, actually taking a much weaker, shittier form of the drug, and they do become addicted? How can that be? This doesn't make sense. And I only began to understand it, and I think it's the key to helping us understand why addiction has gone up in the last 20 months, when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an incredible man named Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment in the 1970s that has transformed how we think about addiction. So Professor Alexander explained to me, this story we have in our heads, that addiction is caused primarily or entirely by chemical hooks, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You guys could try them at home if you're feeling a little bit sadistic. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's our story. You're exposed to the drug, you want more and more of it, you take it until it kills you. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and looked at this experiment and said, well, hang on a minute. You put the rat alone in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except take these drugs. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of friends, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls. Anything a rat can want in life, it's there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water. And this is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drug water. They hardly ever use it. None of them use it compulsively. None of them overdose. So you go from 100% compulsive use and overdose when they don't have the things that make life worth living to no compulsive use and overdose when they do have the things that make life worth living. Now, there's lots of human examples of this. I'll come to some in a minute. But like Gerald said before, the lesson I took from this, I remember leaving the second or third time I interviewed Professor Alexander and thinking, right, so this means the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. Valuable and important though that is to many people, the opposite of addiction is connection. That the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And once you understand that, you can see one of the key reasons why what we do now is such a disaster. So we shame, punish, and stigmatize people with addiction problems, right? We inflict more pain on them. The theory behind that is, if there is any theory behind it, the theory behind that is, oh, we need to inflict pain on them to give them an incentive to stop. But once you understand that pain is the cause of addiction, pain is the fuel, that doesn't solve the problem. That's like adding fuel to the fire, right? So you can see why what we do is so bad. And come back to talking about chemical hooks if you like. Ask me a bit more about that if in the questions if you like. But I want to come to what this tells us about what's happening now, right? Why would addiction go up under COVID when we were already at catastrophic levels? I mean, you think about the death toll from the year 2000 to the start of COVID, the death toll from the opioid crisis alone was bigger than the entire population of Miami-Dade. Imagine tomorrow, someone, the Russians, the Chinese, whoever, nuke Miami and kill every man, woman, and child in that city. More people have died of overdose deaths on opioids alone than that. So we have to think about why this is happening. Now, there's lots of things going on. But the core of this, I think, is that, and it's the core of why it's got worse since. Everyone knows they have natural physical needs. Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we've built is good at lots of things. Many things are better than in the past. We have been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. So let's think about loneliness. For example, in my book, Lost Connections, I go through 9 of these causes, but let's look at loneliness, right? So I'll go sip some water. Let's look at loneliness. Let's think about this before the pandemic first. Before the pandemic, 41% of Americans agreed with this statement, no one knows me well. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none. It's not the average, but it's the most common answer. There are more people who have nobody to turn to than any other option. What is life like when you have nobody to share your joy and your pain with? It's profoundly distressing. I spent a lot of time interviewing the leading expert in the world on loneliness from your neck of the woods, a man named Professor John Cassiopo, who's at Chicago University. I remember him saying to me one day, why do we exist? Why are we here? You, me, everyone you've ever met. Why are we here? One key reason is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't better than the animals. They weren't faster than the animals they took down a lot of the time. They weren't stronger than the animals they took down a lot of the time. But they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And we are the first humans ever to disband our tribes. And it is making us feel terrible. And then we think about COVID. So during COVID, we had to physically separate, and I believe that was necessary to suppress the spread of the virus. But it tells us something if suppressing our social connections leads to a huge increase in overdose deaths, which is what we've seen, big increases in addiction, big increases in suicide, not related to opioids. I think this also tells us something really important about the opioid crisis. We've been told an overly simplistic story about the opioid crisis. So we've been told a story, a kind of version of the Nancy Reagan story from the 80s about crack, right? Where she said, what happened with crack is evil drug dealers came along, they sold these uniquely powerful drugs to people and the drugs took people over. And we now know that was way too simplistic. And a similar thing, we're now telling a kind of liberal version of that about the opioid crisis. This time, the evil drug dealers are the Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, those people. And they are scum. They are disgusting people. Don't misunderstand me. I hope they lose all their money and die in prison. But I've got to tell you, it's way too simplistic to think that they are just the cause of this, right? Any more than Jack Daniels is the cause of alcoholism. It's way too simplistic. They are morally responsible. They did missell these drugs dishonestly, and they did hugely underplay the risks. And that's why I say I think they should literally be in prison. But we've got to look at them in a much deeper way. Where is the opioid crisis happening? Where is it worst, right? If it was just about exposure to the drug, the people who can get the drug most easily would have the biggest problem. So everyone on the faculty at Harvard could tomorrow get opioid-based painkillers, right? They've got really good medical insurance and they've got doctors who trust them. And there is very little opioid addiction among the faculty of Harvard. Where is it highest? Places like Monadnock in New Hampshire, where I've been, places that have been stripped through no fault of the people who live there of so many of the things that people need to live. I mean, there's a study that showed when a factory closes down in a town, opioid addictions double in the next 5 years, right? That tells us something. The leading experts on this, the opioid crisis and what causes it, Professor Ann Case and Professor Angus Dayton, amazing couple, call these deaths of despair. If you plunge people into despair, some people will just be really depressed. Some people will kill themselves and some people will seek to anesthetize themselves through opioids. The solution is to deal with their underlying despair. Bruce Alexander, who did the Rat Park experiment, Professor Alexander, says we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery, and that has huge value. But we need to talk more about social recovery. Something has gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a society. These are signals. We've been treating these problems, depression, anxiety, addiction, opioid addiction, like malfunctions. They are not malfunctions. They are signals. They are telling us something has gone really wrong. So I just want to talk, I'm going to wrap up in about 8 minutes and take questions. I want to talk about places that are getting it right and how we can start to copy them instead of following Harry Anslinger's disastrous script. There are places that built their drug policies around these insights. and I went to them for the research for my book, Chasing the Screen. I'll give you one example. I could talk about the others in the Q&A if you want me to. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in the whole world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is staggering. And every year, the Portuguese government tried the American war on drugs more. They arrested more people, they tried more people, they imprisoned more people, they shamed more people. And every year, the problem got worse. Until finally, one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they were like, look, we can't carry on like this. What are we going to do? So they decided they were going to do something really radical, something nobody had done since Harry Anslinger launched the global war on drugs all those decades before. They said, should we ask some scientists what to do? So they set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man I got to know named Dr. João Goulão. And they said to this panel, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem. And we've agreed in advance, we'll do whatever you recommend. So the goal was to just take it out of politics. So the panel goes away for 2 years. They looked at all the best research, including Rat Park. And they came back and they said, okay, everyone, here's what we're going to do. We are going to decriminalize all drugs from cannabis to crack. We're going to stop punishing anyone who uses or is addicted. But, and this is the crucial next step, we're going to spend all the money we used to spend on screwing people's lives up, shaming them and imprisoning them. And we're going to spend all that money instead on turning their lives around in very practical ways. So they set up a huge program of reconnection for people with addiction problems. They focused on two things. First was housing. Nobody is going to get sober if they don't have a home, right? Secure housing is the most effective strategy for treating addiction. The second thing they did was a huge program of job and meaning creation for people with addiction problems. Say you used to be a mechanic and you developed an addiction problem. They go to a garage and they say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to say to every single person with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back. And by the time I went to Portugal 6 years ago, the results were clear. The best scientific study of this by the British Journal of Criminology found that addiction was down by more than 50%. Overdose deaths were down by 80%. HIV transmission was down by 90%. Portugal went from having almost the worst drug problem out of the 27 members of the European Union to being the bottom, number 27, according to the European Centre of Drug Monitoring and Control, who are the main scientific body who don't have a dog in this fight. They just measure the numbers. Excuse me. And if you want to know how well this worked, nobody in Portugal wants to go back. They have 5 main political parties, competitive political system. None of them want to reverse the decriminalization. And one of the reasons when it became clear to me how successful this had been is I went to interview a man named João Figueira, who was the top drug cop in Portugal at the time of the decriminalization. And he said what lots of people at the time totally understandably think when you say we should decriminalize all drugs. He said, this is crazy. We'll have an explosion in drug use. We'll have children using drugs. We can't do this. And João Figueira said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he told me he felt really ashamed that he spent so many years prior to the decriminalization making people's lives worse when he could have been helping them turn their lives around. And this is something I saw all over the world, from Uruguay to Canada to Switzerland. At first, when you propose ending the drug war, it's hugely controversial. People think it's crazy. And then it happens. And people see that things get better. Not a magic bullet. They still have problems in all those places. But there's such a significant improvement that support massively rises once the decriminalization or legalization, and we can talk about the difference if you want, happens. And Portugal gave me such hope, and it was so important for us all. And I think the most important thing to understand, I just want to end by talking about this and then go to the Q&A, is this is absolutely achievable in the United States, right? 85% of Americans, including big majorities of Republicans, independents, and Democrats, believe the war on drugs has failed. This is a hollow policy. It is killing enormous numbers of Americans. As I say, more than the entire population of Miami-Dade, right? And when I get pessimistic about this and I think, oh, you know, this is a big fight, right? How are we going to win it? I think about my friend Andrew Sullivan. A lot of you will know him. He's a very good American journalist, formerly British, but has lived in the US for 25 years, 30 years. And I think about a specific moment in Andrew's life. In 1994, Andrew was diagnosed as HIV positive, and this is the height of the AIDS crisis. He'd just watched his best friend die at the age of 31 of AIDS. There seemed to be no hope in sight. And Andrew thought he had a few years left to live. So he went to a little town in Cape Cod called Provincetown to die. And in Provincetown, he decided to do one last thing. He decided to write a book about an idea that no one had ever written a book about, a crazy utopian idea. And he thought, well, I'm never going to live to see this idea put into practice. No one alive today is going to live to see this put into practice, but maybe someone somewhere will pick up this idea years from now. The idea that Andrew wrote the first book to propose was gay marriage. And when I feel pessimistic about our ability to end the drug war and move to loving and compassionate policies, I try to imagine going back in time to 1994 and saying to Andrew, okay, Andrew, you're not going to believe me, but 26 years from now, A, you're going to be alive. That would have blown his mind. B, you're going to be married to a man because that's going to be legal in the state where you live. And C, I'll be with you when the Supreme Court of the United States quotes this book that you're writing now, when it makes it mandatory for every state in the United States to introduce gay marriage. And the next day, you'll be invited to a White House that will be lit up in the colors of the rainbow flag by the president to have dinner with him to celebrate what you and millions of others people have achieved. Oh, and by the way, that president, he's going to be black, right? Every aspect of that would have sounded like ludicrous science fiction. It happened. It happened because enough people stood together, appealed to other people in a spirit of love to persuade them, and did not give up. We can absolutely win this. We can end the war on drugs. Lots of people who currently die will have good lives if we do that and help them turn their lives around. For 100 years now, we have been singing war songs about addicts. We should have been singing love songs to them all along. Okay, should we do some questions? I don't know if...
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're going to get to some questions. I think we may have some from online, but thank you so much for that. And I could see you like getting teared up, and I can tell that means a lot to you. I am exhausted all the time. This weekend has been killing me. I'm going to ask my friend Akti to do the question and answer because
Hello.
Because why not?
Hi.
Hello, everybody. My name is Akti and I'm an addict. Hi, I'm Mr. Hari. I work at Above and Beyond. Do you see me?
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Did we meet when I came to Above and Beyond?
No, we did not.
Oh, I love you guys. In my head, I keep saying it wrong as Bed Bath and Beyond.
Me too. I say
yes.
Bed Bath and Beyond. I always say that.
Oh.
Anyway, so do we have any questions from the audience? Yes. Donald McDonald, not.
What an excellent name. We might be related because my mother's maiden name is McDonald.
I attended the webinar you and Maya Salavitz did together.
Oh.
Mentioned my name during the. It's a great name. Okay. So listen, in America, how do we promote the same kind of omnipartisan support that was achieved in Portugal, when I don't think that resistance to ending the drug war is an ideological one. I think that there's money involved. Who's getting rich from the drug war? Is it criminal justice systems, treatment systems? Where do we follow the money and where do we attack them so that politicians can be free to provide the support for finally ending this atrocity?
This is a really important question, Donald. I'm going to say your full name because I like it so much. It's a very good question, Donald McDonald. No, it's a really important question. So I think there's a truth in what you're saying, but I don't think we want to take it too far. So sometimes you get people who say, when you say, why does the drug war continue? And they focus, as you're doing, on the people who profit from the current model. And I will come to that because you're right, there are people who profit from the current model. I don't think that's the main reason why the drug war continues. The main reason the drug war continues, I think, is much simpler. If you're a politician, you're constantly making a calculation. If I do X thing, how much praise will I get and how much shit will I get? And generally, if the praise outweighs the shit, you'll do it. And if the shit outweighs the praise, you won't, right? So think about gay equality for gay people, right? As recently as, 25 years ago, President Clinton, who was privately pro-gay, signed the Defense of Marriage Act because there were like 15% of people who wanted to treat gay people equally and 85% of people who didn't. And today, if you look at people under the age of 40, that's literally reversed. So majorities of young Republicans, for example, are in favor of gay marriage. So there was a kind of cultural change that meant public opinion change, which meant politicians acted differently. I think the drug war is like that. And the biggest obstacle we have when it comes to public opinion, in my view, is people think that what we're doing has been a disaster. They can see, and the arguments for compassion for people with addiction problems are really prevailing, but people are afraid of the alternatives. So they hear words like decriminalization and legalization, and they don't picture the Portuguese model. They picture a kind of ludicrous caricature, like, that we want to give drugs to children, or we want to have a heroin aisle in CVS or something, which like no one wants, right? In fact, quite the opposite. These policies, the policies that I'm arguing for, protect children much better. I can talk about why if you want. So you're right that there are vested interests who benefit. And if you want to know who they are, it's kind of easy to figure out. Just look at who funds the no side whenever there's a referendum on legalization of a drug or decriminalization. So you can look at the recent wonderful Oregon initiative to decriminalize there. So it's basically prison guard unions, some police unions, some very extreme religious groups, although there are religious groups on the other side as well. Who else? Oh, alcohol companies sometimes. It's usually in cannabis legalization referendums because they don't want a popular commercial competitor. And I'm trying to think. I mean, there is another group who financially benefit, although they don't fund the referenda, who are drug dealers, right, and drug lords. I interviewed Pablo Escobar's son, Sebastian Marroquin, who used to be called Pablo Escobar Jr. You can guess why he doesn't use that name anymore. I interviewed him in Buenos Aires, and he said to me, the only thing my father ever truly feared was the legalization of drugs. Because, he said, if drugs had been legal, my dad would have been a used car salesman and you would have never heard his name, which I think is undoubtedly true. So there are these vested interests, and there's good reasons to take on these vested interests for all sorts of reasons to take on prison guard unions, police unions. You guys know much better than me why. But I don't think that's the main obstacle. I think we should do that. We should take on those groups. We should expose them. I don't think it's the main obstacle. The main obstacle is about changing the minds of ordinary people. When that change in public opinion happens, as it has happened on cannabis, I mean, again, we think about President Clinton, the day he left office, the year 2000 doesn't seem so long ago, 10% of Americans supported legalizing cannabis. Now it's 70%. So you can have these big changes very quickly. But I think it's mainly about changing public opinion, although you're right to want to expose these groups, and they are awful. Someone's asked here in the Q&A, what is the difference between legalization and decriminalization? And this is a really important question. Decriminalization is where you stop punishing users and addicts, but they still have to go to criminals to get their drug, armed criminals. Legalization is where you open up some legal route to get that drug. It's important to say, most people think that the legalization should work differently according to different drugs. So I don't know the rules in Illinois, but I'm pretty sure you guys, if you really wanted to, could own a dog, a monkey, and a lion. But the rules are different, right? I'm sure you could go into a store and just buy a dog. For a monkey, you probably need a license. And a lion, I'm sure they come and like inspect your house and make sure you're not a crazy person. So they're all legal, but they're legal in different ways. There's different regulatory infrastructures for all three of them, right? So I would argue for legalization in a similar model. So cannabis, I think, should be legal like alcohol. You've got to be over 21. You can only buy a certain amount. You control the amount of THC in the drug, so it's not super strong. All of those things. And of course, you severely punish people who sell to children, and so on. I would actually have tighter rules. I wouldn't allow commercial advertising of alcohol or cannabis. You're not allowed commercial advertising of alcohol in Europe, most parts of Europe. So that's cannabis, right? Let's think about another drug, heroin. I don't know anyone who's in favor of legalizing heroin the way we've legalized cannabis, right? I don't know anyone who's in favor of that. Switzerland did legalize heroin. They did it differently. So if you've got a heroin problem in Switzerland, you go to your doctor and you're offered a range of options. You can go to sobriety-based, abstinence-based recovery treatment if you want it. You can go for methadone if you want it, or you can be assigned to a heroin clinic. So I went to the heroin clinic in Geneva, where you're given your heroin there. You have to go really early in the morning because Swiss people believe in doing things really early. You have to turn up at 7 o'clock in the morning. They give you your heroin there. You use it there. You can't take it out with you, partly because they don't want you to sell it on the streets, but also they want to monitor you while you use the drug. And then you leave and you go to your job because you're given help to get work, housing, and therapy. In Switzerland, since they legalized heroin 20 years ago, does anyone in the audience want to shout out how many people they think have died of overdoses on legal heroin? I can't hear you, so I hope you're shouting it out. Yeah. 0. More people have died in the United States of heroin overdoses since you started listening to me by far than have died in 20 years on the legal heroin program in Switzerland. And in the illegal use in Switzerland has massively fallen because who wants to buy shitty contaminated street heroin when you can go to the clinic and get it, get much better heroin and loads of help to turn your life around. So different models of legalization for different drugs. There are some drugs where no one has tried legal models of regulation yet. We've had 100 years of the whole world being forced by the United States government to have one approach to this, right? So think about ecstasy, for example. We've nowhere has ever tried a legal model. I would guess that we should try places you could buy them at music festivals where it was tested, where it was legally manufactured. What we need to do is cautiously experiment with alternative. We should certainly decriminalize. Punishing users and addicts is a disaster. In terms of legalization, I think we should cautiously experiment with the alternatives. I can talk more about why if you want, but I don't want to give a really long answer.
Any questions online? Any questions in the house? All right, Mr. Harry, I think we're done. Wait, hold on.
It's like 3 o'clock in the morning, right?
Oh, sorry. I'm basically a nocturnal person, so this is fine. I basically live on Central Time while in Britain, so don't worry.
Nobody has any more questions. Samantha has a question. Come on down, Samantha. Come on.
So you talk about how people in hospitals are basically getting, really good heroin, and how a lot of people aren't coming out of the hospitals addicted. But I thought that what we found is that a lot of people's addictions are starting in the hospital. So I was wondering if you can speak to that and some of the research.
Yeah, it's a really important question, Samantha. So we have to look at for addiction, you need the object of the addiction, whether it's gambling, pornography, opioids. You obviously need to have that, but it needs to meet something else as well. So if you go into a bar tonight, you look around you, the vast, as you know, 90% of the people there will be drinking alcohol because it makes their life better, because it helps them unwind. They're having a laugh, they like the taste, whatever it might be. And there will be a small minority of people in that bar who have an alcohol addiction problem, and they need our help, right? So what we have to ask is, why do some people become addicted and other people don't? And more importantly, so some people say, oh, it's just genetics. Now, the evidence on this is very clear. Your genes can make you more vulnerable to these problems, but they don't write your destiny, right? But if it was purely genetic, the amount of addiction in a society would be stable over time, right? Because your genes don't suddenly evolve as you get older. But that's not what happens. So, for example, like we were talking about, we've had a really big increase under COVID in addiction problems. What happened? It's not that people's genes changed. It's not that suddenly drugs were more available. They're as available as they ever were, including alcohol. What happened is the society was more distressed, right? People were lonelier. They were more financially insecure. They were more frightened. And so more people wanted to anesthetize themselves. So it's absolutely true. Some people go into hospital, they're exposed to opioids and leave with an addiction problem. What you have to ask is, more than 95% of people who go into hospital are exposed to opioids don't become addicted. So what's going on there? What's going on there is the 5% who do become addicted. The figures can vary between 5 and 20%. The people who do become addicted, what's going on? The opioid which plays a real role, and chemical hooks are real. I can talk about that if you want. Meets the person's despair, right? So every addiction, and you guys know this much better than I do, but addiction is an attempt to solve a problem. It's not a good solution to the problem for all sorts of obvious reasons, but it's an attempt to solve a problem. It's an attempt to solve an underlying despair. So if we want to understand why some people are very powerfully drawn to painkillers, I would argue we need to understand why they're in so much pain. And throughout history, whenever there's a huge increase in addiction, it's a sign of something going wrong in the society. So in the 18th century in Britain, there was a huge increase in alcoholism. It was called the Gin Craze, right? Massive explosion in alcohol, really bad alcohol addiction. And what had happened? Huge numbers of people had been driven out of the countryside into these disgusting urban slums. They were forced off the land where they had meaning and a sense of purpose, into these terrible, horrible urban slums. And loads of them started just drinking all the time. Now, at the time, people said, look at this evil drug gin. Look at what it does to people. It takes them over. It destroys them. Now we know it can't have been gin that caused that, because any adult in Britain can go and buy gin. And we don't have, of course, we have some alcoholism, but we don't have this huge explosion of alcoholism that we had then. What happened? People's lives are better, right? So like I said in the speech, where is the opioid crisis happening? It's not happening just of course, it can originate in medical settings. It can originate in non-medical settings as well. But where is it happening? It's happening in the places where despair is highest. So if you look at Professor Case's work, she has shown opioid deaths are highest in the places where suicides not by opioids are highest, in the places where antidepressant prescriptions are highest. Why would that be? If it was just about, the drug took them over, why would that be? No, these things cluster together because they're all about despair, right? Opioid addiction, like all addiction, is an attempt to remedy despair. It's not a good remedy. It's why we have to have good remedies, like what happened in Portugal. More importantly, we need to regenerate the society. We've got to be honest. A lonely society where people are controlled and humiliated at work, where they are really financially insecure, where they're very frightened about the future, that's going to be a society with a lot of addiction problems. We need to heal the society. And I know that's a big thing to say, but the crisis is really big, and we've just got to be honest about it. So to just, this is not what you're doing, I know, but to just engage in this kind of fantasy thinking, which is being promoted as if, if only we took away Percocet, all these people who are killing themselves with overdoses, suddenly what they would presumably just magically, it would be okay. I mean, this is a delusion, right? Those Percocet overdoses and the other OxyContin and so on, those are symptoms of a really profound despair. And we've got to hear the despair and deal with the despair in the way Portugal did, with a profound regeneration of the society. So yeah, of course, being exposed to a drug, if you're in despair and you start taking, if you're in despair and you start looking at a lot of pornography, you can become obsessed with pornography. If you're in despair and you go into a casino in Vegas, you can become obsessed with roulette and craps. And I think it's really important to think about those addictions that are not drug-based, like gambling, like pornography, because go to any meeting of Gamblers Anonymous and you'll see they're as addicted as the people in the Narcotics Anonymous meeting up the hall, right? But no one, you don't inject a pack of cards, you don't snort a roulette wheel, right? There's no physical chemical hook in gambling addiction. If you can have all of the addiction and none of the chemical hooks, that tells us that the role of chemical hooks has been overstated. And we've got to think more about what are the underlying forms of despair that the addiction is trying to solve. It's not a good way to solve it. Obviously, you can die of an overdose. It's not a good way to live. But we've got to think about, what does it mean about our society that for a lot of people, the best solution they've been offered to their despair is a pack of OxyContin. That's a sign of how spiritually awry we've gone as a culture.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Samantha, I couldn't hear you there.
Oh, I just said very helpful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So it's kind of late here, and it looks like everybody's kind of shut down. Are we kind of out of questions? Oh, wait, we got one. What?
I'll try and answer quickly. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Everybody's like such in a daze from what you're saying. Hold on. We have a question here.
Yes, hi. So alcohol and drug-related crimes. My name is Ginger, and I'm thinking about my uncle who murdered his wife, who was an alcoholic. I'm thinking about people I know who are addicted to drugs and alcohol who commit crimes. And you talk about the decriminalization of, and I do agree that decriminalization, I've always agreed that that's a good idea. But what do we do when, and I understand we offset that by providing services to people as early as possible when they're children. But I don't understand how we are going to hold people not accountable. I mean, I don't understand how that really sort of can solve the serious abuse that is going on, that, that Billie Holiday suffered from, that still is rampant in America even.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for what you've gone through, Ginger. That sounds really horrendous. And I'm really sorry that you've had those experiences and that your family has suffered in that way. So I think you've asked a really important question, which is, of course, some people, when they have addiction problems, harm other people in ways that break the law. And so you've raised a really important point. When people say you should decriminalize, what it means is you don't punish people for using drugs or being addicted to drugs. Of course, if in the course of your addiction you murder somebody, you should be put on trial for murder and you should be sent to prison for a very long time. And I mean, that's an extreme example, but no one is suggesting you should decriminalize things that rightly are crimes. It's just that drug use and drug addiction should not be crimes. Just the fact of using drugs or being addicted shouldn't be a crime. Of course, if you commit other crimes, you need to be held responsible for that. But I think the way you've gone to a really important thing, because you said, how can decriminalization solve these other things like what Billie Holiday went through? And that was what was so interesting to me in Portugal and spending a lot of time there, particularly with social workers, is firstly, it frees up a huge amount of money. I mean, the United States has spent $1 trillion on the war on drugs. So you think about if all that money, well, think about how much money was spent on Billie Holiday, right? They send a police officer to follow her around for 18 months. They send her to prison for 18 months. They spend, then tens of thousands, now it would be the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars, documenting her drug use, harassing her, punishing her. Imagine if all that money instead had been spent on exactly what you say, helping prevent child abuse right at the beginning of the story, right? Imagine if when she's 10 years old and she's found and she's been raped, that money was spent on like helping her, providing love and care and compassion. Or when they busted the brothel where she was working, in inverted commas, you know, when she's 12 and 13, again, what did they do? They punish her. All that money could have been spent on helping her. So I think decriminalization makes it possible to deal with those problems in several ways. Firstly, it frees up enormous amounts of money to actually do good stuff. Secondly, it changes the relationship of people with addiction problems to the government and to the state. Because it's one of the things that was really interesting to me in Portugal. The social worker said to me, when drugs were decriminalized, people stopped running away from us. When they were going out to, I've been doing a lot of work in Las Vegas with people who live in the tunnels beneath the city, a lot of whom have addiction problems. The minute anyone from the police, the local authorities appears, they just run, right? Because they keep being arrested for having drugs. When you decriminalize, it creates a completely different relationship between the vulnerable person and the authorities. They're not the enemy anymore. They might be able to help you. So you don't just free up the money to help people, you also make it possible for a connection between help and ordinary people that's really hard in a machinery that's built primarily around punishing and shaming people. So it makes all sorts of changes possible. But you're right, it's not a magic bullet, right? There's still a huge amount of problems. Decriminalization isn't going to solve all these problems. What it is, it solves some of the problems, to be sure, and it makes it possible for a different kind of relationship. But you're right, healing is a very long process, and you're absolutely right that people who are committing crimes against other, addiction is a crime against yourself, right? But people who are committing, and therefore I think it should not be a crime for all sorts of reasons. I think it shouldn't be a crime. People who are committing crimes against other people have to be stopped, right? And if necessary, have to be punished. And of course, I'm in favor of that. We don't, decriminalizing drugs is not a license for people with addiction problems to go and harm other people. Actually, it's a way of helping them stop harming themselves. And that in turn means they are less likely to harm other people. And again, you saw this in Portugal. After the decriminalization, one of the reasons it was so popular with the people who didn't have an addiction problem is just all sorts of crime went down massively. Mugging went down hugely, car thefts went down hugely, street prostitution went down hugely. Because when you help people and they're not addicted anymore and they can recover from their addiction, they're less likely to commit crimes against other people. Do you see what I mean? I feel like I haven't explained that very well. I apologize, but
She said perfect. Johann, I have you have a one-line question? I have a couple people here that are kind of patrons of mine. Akil Khan, who runs Project Open Grant that funds a lot of our work, and Tanya Sorrell from Rush Medical Center runs a lot of our work. So I'm going to force them to ask their question, and she's looking at me like I just threw a dog at her. Here.
Thank you so much. My name's Tanya Sorrell. I'm with Rush
oh, I'm
University.
sorry, I can't really hear you.
Hello?
Oh, hi.
There it
I
is.
can hear you.
Thank you so much. My name's
Can you hear
Tanya Sorrell. I'm with Rush University Medical Center. And I'm thinking of a question because I was so appreciative of what you were saying today. I was actually speaking earlier about how moving from the moralistic and shaming of substance use back to harm reduction and humanity actually occurred as part of the racial and socioeconomic issues that happened in the early 1900s. So thanks for the support and understanding how those may be. How do we work to continue in this broader face of recognizing that it's not only just as you mentioned, despair, but it actually encompasses a number of the socioeconomic disparities that are happening in the United States, in particularly in regard to housing economic disparities, how crime, as you mentioned, is policed in some areas, food deserts, a number of the holistic things that we, as you said, these are the things that we need as the building blocks of humanity. How do we also look at recognizing that the substance use is part of that larger problem of the disparate issues across our country right now? Particularly given the fact that a number of groups, particularly politically, don't really see those still as issues to overcome. In what way can we not only move forward in regard to substance use, but also moving forward in the way of that, the whole systems of equity and humanity and seeing all of us together?
Yeah, it's a really deep question. I think at some level, people know this is true, right? I feel ridiculous saying this to you because you know this better than I do, but the only thing that's ever changed these things, we can wait for a leader and a messiah for 1,000 years and they're not going to come, right? The only thing that's ever changed these things is organizing politically and demanding something better and persuading other people. And this has led to an incredible transformation. I know it's extremely irritating for a man to mansplain this, but I think about my grandmothers. So I'm 42. When my grandmothers were 42 years old, one of them was in Scotland, one of them was in Switzerland. They weren't allowed to have bank accounts in their own names. Their husbands could legally rape them. My grandmother in Switzerland didn't even have the vote. They weren't allowed to work outside the home without their husband's written permission. The difference between my grandmother's life and my niece's life, my niece is 16 and looks just like one of my grandmothers, which so it really touches my heart. Even like the most crazy misogynists don't want to go, maybe the really crazy ones, but no one in public life wants to go back to how we were with women, right? How did that change? Didn't happen because men decided to be nice, right? It'd be lovely to think that, but it's not true. It happened because ordinary women banded together and saying, we're not taking this shit anymore. We've had enough, right? And it took a long time, and we're still only a fraction of the way there. You know, what's just, you know, again, much better than me, what's just happened in Texas, the risk to women's rights everywhere. But we have, I know that the difference between my grandmother's lives and my niece's life is an incredible progress. And it only happened because a lot of women and some sympathetic men fought for it. And they did not give up when it was hard and it was difficult and they were beaten down and it was humiliating. They fought and they fought and they fought and they clawed their way to something better. And I think on all the issues you mentioned, we have to do that. But in a funny way, and this might sound like a strange thing to say, the scale of the despair, which is dreadful and terribly painful, is actually something on our side, because despair is cutting across all the political divides. In fact, the places where people are dying most of overdoses is actually the places where President Trump had his highest level of support, right? This does not fit on a kind of easy, it's the most Democratic districts and the most Republican districts that have the highest levels of overdose deaths. So when all the fire alarms are going off, it's hard for people to deny there's something going wrong, right? And so I think the scale of the crisis and the despair in the society does actually create some pressure for change. That can be negative change, right? I'm sure you can guess my politics. That could be negative change, but that can also be positive change. So I think we have to follow the model of our grandmothers and our mothers in what they did to advance the rights of women. We have to follow the model of gay people. We have to follow the model of the civil rights movement. All incomplete movements, to be sure. But, and again, I feel so stupid saying this to you because I know that you know this better than I do. But yeah, anyway, I could talk about that a long time, but I think and we've got to explain that these are absolutely, as you say, interconnected issues. It's not like there's addiction policy over here and housing over there. And and solving the healthcare crisis over there. I mean, it's crazy that they're all densely interconnected and they have to be solved together, and they absolutely can be solved together.
Thanks for that. Johann, good morning. This is Akil Khan with Project Open. We
Hello.
run a multi-county grant with various stakeholders. We have an aspirational statement to break the intergenerational cycle of trauma. You mentioned a number of strategies: legalization, decriminalization. Those could be immediate solutions. One of our big goals is prevention, and we believe that addressing the unmet social emotional need of the youth is one of the biggest things we can do to break that cycle and prevent addiction from happening. What would you say would you agree with that? And then what would you say is the next most important thing we can start working on today to prevent the future generation from turning to substances to cope with issues?
I mean, the work you're doing is the crucial, it's so important. And there's so many things that do that. I mean, firstly, we've got to have so child protection services are grotesquely underfunded in the United States and are not able to offer people substantial help in a lot of cases. So number one, let's take some of the money we spend on throwing people in prison, which traumatizes their kids, and spend some of that on child protective services, right? Or think about if we just release all the non-violent drug offenders, think about how many children get their dads back or their mothers back, right? So there's there's just so much there. And I think you're absolutely right, because if you break that chain of trauma, the transmission of trauma, and again, you know this infinitely better than I do, and you should be incredibly proud of your work, then you don't just save that person, you save the person 30 years later, the person 30 years later than that, 30 years later than that. So breaking these chains is absolutely crucial. And again, it comes back to what your colleague Tanya asked. It's much easier to be kind to your kids if you've got a secure housing. If you're terrified that you're going to be evicted, again, you know this better than I do, but or if you can't take your child to the doctor because you can't afford it, so all these things are densely interconnected. But you're totally right. There's a lot we need to do to break that. But I would say, let's get the non-violent drug offenders out of prison so they can be parents, and let's fund child protective services with the money that we were burning by putting them in jail. But there's 100 other things I could have said, as you know better than I do. So there's so many things to do on that front.
We have a question in the channel. I think you might be able to read it. Can you?
Yeah. So are you familiar with the ACEs study? Do you believe that if professionals identify children or adults who experience multiple adverse childhood experiences and help to treat these individuals, we would see less individuals with addiction issues? Yeah. So I actually interviewed the scientists who did the ACEs study. For people who don't know, Dr. Vincent Felitti was the guy who did it initially. People don't know, he was a doctor in San Diego. I'm sure everyone in the audience knows this, but he showed that people who've been through childhood trauma are significantly more likely to have addiction problems. And the more traumatic your childhood, sorry, it's not a comment on there.
Bless you.
Right. Thank you. The more traumatic your childhood, the more likely you are to have an addiction problem. But I actually think the most important thing about the ACEs study is the second part of that's really important, what they discovered. Most important for me is the second part, which is they showed giving people loving spaces where just authority figures like doctors say to them, I see you experienced this childhood trauma. This is terrible. That should never have happened to you. I'm really sorry that you were failed in that way. Led to a significant reduction in depression, anxiety, and obesity, I think, interestingly. They didn't measure it for addiction. But there's a really interesting guy called Professor Steve Coles at UCLA, who I interviewed, who showed a really interesting study. It was looking at gay men with HIV during the AIDS crisis. And what he found is openly gay men died on average 2 years later than closeted gay men, even when they got healthcare at the same point in the progression of AIDS, which seems weird. Why would that be? The reason is shame destroys you, right? Shame physically destroys you. It psychologically destroys you. It's not the trauma that screws you up. The trauma's bad, but what really destroys you is the shame about the trauma. If you've been abused, very often you internalize the voice of the abuser. You think you don't deserve to be treated well. And so giving people ways to reduce that shame is very powerful. Now, some of that's interpersonal through therapy, through support groups, through the work that a lot of you guys do. Some of that's societal. It's hard to reduce shame if the society's saying that you're a criminal because you're anesthetizing yourself. What we did to Billie Holiday and untold hundreds of thousands, millions, in fact, more people. So yeah, the ACEs study is massively important. And I think it's generally the second bit no one talks about. And to me, that's the most important bit of it.
Okay, well, are there any more questions here? Online? So we've got one last thing, Johann, if you don't mind. We're gonna invite whoever wants to go up on stage next to your picture. We're gonna take a photo because you couldn't be here and we want to put it on our website. So anybody who wants to go up and get in the picture, please go up there.
This is really creepy. I feel like I'm a hologram or something.
You're the hologram of Tupac.
That is the only time I have ever been compared to Tupac. And I think it will never happen again in my lifetime. Hello, is it like you're picking my nose? Hello. Hello, everyone. I would start trying to do a Tupac song, but I think I would get cancelled. Oh, thanks, everyone.
They're like, there's a big line. I will send this photo to you.
My idea of hell is having my face projected onto a large screen, so this is very disturbing. Thank you.
All right, man. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Johann.
everyone. You should
We'll
all be
talk
so
soon.
proud. You should all be so proud of the work you're doing. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
Brilliant. Cheers, Gerald. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Thank you.